At 11 p.m. on August 10, 2003, 19-year-old Sonya Ivanov and her best friend Timuri Tworak were walking down a street that was lined with a few shops, bars, and houses in Nome, Alaska. Both young women had long dark hair, and they were dressed almost the same in jeans, tennis shoes, and t-shirts. But Sonya was quite a bit taller. She was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and her height made her stand out no matter what she was wearing. Even though it was 11 o'clock at night, the sun was still out and shining overhead, because Nome, Alaska is less than 150 miles from the Arctic Circle, and that far north, at that time of the summer, the sun doesn't actually set until close to midnight. Sonya and Timuri were accustomed to the long summer days and the midnight sunsets because they'd spent their entire lives in Northwest Alaska. They were both Alaska Natives, which is a term used to define the multiple groups of Alaska's indigenous people. And they had both grown up over 100 miles south of Nome in a tiny village that was made up almost entirely of Alaska Natives. But not long after Sonya had graduated high school a year earlier, she had moved to Nome, and Timuri had followed her soon after that. And as Sonya and Timuri walked down the street that night, they still felt like they were living in a big city. In reality, Nome was just a small remote town that was home to only about 3,500 people, but it was still a lot bigger than where Sonya and Timuri had come from. And Nome's residents were a collection of Alaska Natives, as well as people who had grown up in town and others who had traveled there from far away to live in a place that a lot of people called America's Last Frontier. Sonya and Timuri walked past a bar, and they could hear music and laughter coming from inside. Then they turned off the main road and onto a side street and walked over to a friend's small wooden house. Sonya and Timuri stepped up onto the raised porch, and then Sonya knocked on the door. And then a moment later, their friend opened the door and stretched up on her toes to reach Sonya's shoulders and gave Sonya a big hug. Then Sonya and Timuri headed inside to the cramped living room, flopped down on the couch, and settled in for a night of board games with friends. And just a moment later, a young woman about Sonya's age walked into the living room from the kitchen and handed Sonya a can of beer. Sonya cracked open the beer, took a swig, and smiled. When Sonya had first moved to Nome from the village she grew up in, her parents had been worried that she was too young and naive to handle city life. Everybody in their small village knew Sonya, and all of the adults there looked out for all the kids. And Sonya had been a star basketball player at her high school, so she was even kind of famous in her own little town. And her parents really hoped she would stay at least a little longer in a place where she was loved, protected, and admired. But Sonya had told her parents that she felt like she had to go to Nome to get a job that would let her save up enough money to go to college. Because for most of her life, she dreamed of going off to college and experiencing new places and learning about new things. Sonya was outgoing, she was funny, and almost always in a very good mood. And so when she had arrived in Nome, she quickly landed work at a healthcare facility and she made a close group of friends. But she still felt connected to her roots because Timuri and her shared a small house, and Sonya's sister and brother-in-law lived close by. So pretty soon after Sonya had moved away and kind of found her place in Nome, her parents relaxed, and they were happy that their daughter seemed to be thriving in her new home. But what Sonya hadn't told her parents, or really anyone other than her best friend Timuri, was that she dreamed of a lot more than just going to college. She dreamed of making enough money to move away to Hawaii. Sonya loved her family, and she was proud of her Alaska Native heritage. In fact, when she had first moved to Nome, she had entered the Arctic Native Brotherhood pageant, which was an event where young people celebrated their native culture and spoke about important native issues of the time. But as much as Sonya loved the place and the culture she came from, she had gotten tired of the dark, cold winters in Northwest Alaska, those times when the sun was only up for a few hours and temperatures regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So now Sonya liked to imagine herself on a warm, sunny beach in Hawaii, listening to the waves crash onto the sand. She knew her family would be sad to see her leave, but she just felt like going somewhere far away was something she had to do while she was still young. In the living room, Sonya drank her beer, she laughed and played a board game with her friends, and they all talked about work and guys and girls they had crushes on like most groups of teenagers do. But then, at around midnight, the group fell silent for a second, because they heard a police siren wailing on a street nearby. Sonya and Timuri almost always felt safe in Nome, but there were times when they would hear police sirens that reminded them they were not in their little home village anymore. And Sonya's sister and her brother-in-law, who lived near Sonya, told her never to ignore her surroundings. Because in Nome, like across Alaska and the rest of the United States, Alaska Native women and Native American women were assaulted, abducted, and murdered at rates that were higher than the national average. And while the group of teenagers sat in Sonya's friend's living room that night, Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police was the one who was blaring the siren in his SUV while he was on his way to respond to a domestic violence call nearby. Officer Owens was originally from Florida, and he had noticed during his few years on the Nome police force that long summer nights often led people to drink, stay up late, and get into trouble a lot more than they ever did during the winter. But back at Sonya's friend's house, not long after the sound of the siren had faded, the group of teenagers put any thought of the police out of their minds, and Sonya and her friends got back to talking, laughing, and playing their board game. And then, at about 1 a.m. on August 11th, 2 hours after Sonya had arrived, she stood up from the couch and decided it was time for her to head home. Sonya said goodnight to the group, and Timmery said she was actually going to stay for a bit longer and that most likely she would just crash there for the night, so she would see Sonya at their place sometime the next day. Then Sonya and Timmery shared what they called their best friend goodbye ritual. They each tapped 2 of their fingers on the other's shoulder, then kissed their fingers, pointed them at the sky, and said, "Peace out, pal," to each other. Sonya opened the door and stepped outside. And as she started walking home, she thought to herself that she really needed to convince Tamari to come with her to Hawaii, because she couldn't imagine being there without her best friend who she had known for basically her whole life. Just after 1 a.m., so a few minutes after Sonya had left her friend's house, Sonya turned onto the main drag that cut through the center of town, and she walked along the side of the road. The sun had finally set, and it was about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A light rain had started to fall, and Nome looked like it was covered in mist. And as much as Sonya had gotten sick of the cold Alaska winters, she loved rainy Alaska summer nights like this one. So she decided to take her time walking home and to enjoy being outside in the rain. She walked past the bar, and she still heard music coming from inside. Then she walked a little bit further past an old house that overlooked the main street, and as she walked by, she heard someone call her name from the dark. Sonya was startled, and she felt her shoulders tense up. Then she turned and saw an older woman she knew sitting on the front porch smoking a cigarette. And Sonya laughed at herself for being scared. She exhaled and relaxed her shoulders. The woman smiled and asked Sonya how she was doing. Sonya said she was doing fine, and then she told the woman to have a good night and waved goodbye. Sonya kept walking down the street, and as she did, she felt the rain falling on her face. Then at some point, she heard people coming out of the bar that she had passed a little ways back, and she realized it must be getting late. But Sonya didn't have to work the next day, so she could just go home and sleep in as late as she wanted to, and the thought of that made her smile. Then, as Sonya approached a brightly lit gas station, she heard a car coming up behind her. So she stepped even more to the side of the road to make sure the car could pass her, but the car pulled up right next to her and stopped. The passenger side window rolled down, the driver leaned across the seat and called out to Sonya. And so Sonya, she stopped walking, and then she looked at the driver and actually approached the car. Sonya then leaned in through the open window and talked to the driver for a bit longer, and then Sonya climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. At around 5 p.m. on August 11th, so about 15 hours after Sonya had gotten into that car, Timmery came home from work. She was exhausted because she had stayed up late with her friends and then gone into work without sleeping much. She had come back to her and Sonya's house briefly that morning before heading to her job, and she hadn't seen Sonya, but she didn't think much of it. There was a chance Sonya had gotten up early and gone out for the day, or she might have run into friends on her way home and ended up staying somewhere else, which wasn't out of the ordinary for Sonya and Timmery, and neither of them had cell phones, so they didn't always keep in regular contact when they were apart. But hours after Timmery had gotten home from work, Sonya still had not come by the house or called, so Timmery decided to check in with Sonya's sister. Timmery called her on the landline and asked if she or her husband had seen or heard from Sonya in the last 24 hours. Sonya's sister said no, but she didn't sound worried at all. Sonya was 19 years old, and her sister knew she liked to go out and have a good time with friends, and she also knew there was a guy or two Sonya had been seeing. So she told Timmery that Sonya was probably just out and would most likely be home sometime soon. And so that night, Timmery went to bed kind of early because she was still worn out from her day, and she figured she'd either hear Sonia come home later that night or she would see her in the morning. But by the following afternoon, Timmerie still had not seen or heard anything from Sonia, and now Timmerie was starting to get worried. She called Sonia's sister again, but again, the sister said she had not heard from Sonia, and so Timmerie decided that she had to tell the police. But Timmerie had grown up in a small village that did not have a traditional police department, so she didn't even really know how to go about telling the police what was happening. And so she decided it would be best for her to just go to the police station and talk to someone in person. Timmerie threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, she slipped on her tennis shoes, and she headed towards the police station in the center of town. The rain had stopped, but it was still cool and gray outside. It only took a few minutes for Timmerie to get to the police station. She walked inside the small building that was lit up with bright fluorescent lights, and she was greeted by Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native who had responded to the domestic violence call when Timmerie and Sonia had been at their friend's house. Officer Owens asked Timmerie what she needed, and Timmerie would tell him that, Sonia, her friend, had gone missing and she hadn't heard or seen from her since she had left to walk home over 24 hours earlier. Officer Owens was just about 29 years old, and he had brown hair, a goatee, and a warm smile. He tried to put Timmerie at ease because it was obvious she was very upset, and he told her that the police had not gotten any reports about anything out of the ordinary over the last day. Then another officer who was sitting nearby overheard the conversation, and he walked over to them. He said the best explanation was probably that her friend had gone out partying, and she was either still partying or recovering somewhere with friends. But Timmerie said that Sonia had only had one beer on the night they were last hanging out, so it wasn't like she was just wandering around town drunk. But the officer said there still probably wasn't anything to worry about. Then one of the officers took down Sonia's name and Timmerie's personal information, and then told Timmerie they would call her if they heard anything. Timmerie thanked the officers, she turned around and walked out of the station. But as she headed home, she felt like she'd been totally blown off. And she didn't like to buy into stereotypes, but she knew a lot of her friends and family believed that the cops in town would do as little as possible when it came to helping Alaska Native women, and she really hoped that was not the case. Not long after Timmerie had left the police station, the phone in the police station rang, and Officer Matt Owens answered it. Sonia's boss was on the other line, and he was calling to say that Sonia had not come into work that day, and he was worried because Sonia never missed work or was even late without calling first. Owens hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Then he got up and walked the short distance across the station to the chief of police's office. The chief waved Owens in and asked him what was going on. And Owens told him about Timmerie's visit, about her friend Sonia, and now Sonia's boss had just called. And so Owens said they might have a legitimate missing persons case on their hands. At 8:30 p.m. on August 13th, the day after Timmerie had gone to the police station, a volunteer firefighter was driving on an old dirt road about 5 miles outside of Nome. After the chief of police had talked to Officer Owens about Sonia, he contacted the fire department and a couple of community groups to help organize a search for Sonia. And the volunteer firefighter had gotten the call, went right out to his car, and started driving in and around the city to help the search however he could. He was driving slowly, looking out the windshield and both windows, trying not to miss anything that might lead him to Sonia. The road he was on had once been very busy when Nome had experienced a gold rush all the way back in the 1890s, but now the roads around the old gold mines were pretty much abandoned and almost nobody ever drove on them. But most people in town knew that young couples still would sometimes find their way out to the abandoned roads to spend some time together alone, and that the area near the mines had become a kind of lover's lane. And the volunteer firefighter thought, maybe Sonia and a guy she was seeing had come out that way, and maybe they'd gotten stuck in the mud after the rainstorm or something like that. The volunteer firefighter continued to scan both sides of the narrow road, but all he could see was bushes and thick underbrush stretching out in both directions. But then suddenly something caught his eye and he slammed on the brakes. He looked out the driver's side window and stared into a bush. He thought something was out there, but he couldn't tell what it was. So he turned off the engine, he got out of his car and walked over to those bushes. Then he crouched down and peered inside the bushes, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His stomach turned and he felt like he might get sick, but he made himself turn around and run back to his car. He He climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, turned it around, and sped down the old narrow mining road and back into town as fast as he could. Less than 30 minutes later, the same volunteer firefighter was heading back to the bushes on the side of the old mining road, this time in the passenger seat of a Nome police SUV that was being driven by Officer Brian Wayavana. Officer Wayavana headed down the road and stopped when the volunteer fireman told him to. Then Wayavana stepped out of the SUV and walked over to the bushes by himself. Wayavana was in his mid-30s with dark black hair and a black mustache, and he smoked cigarettes regularly while on the job. He would often say that being a cop in Nome was 39.5 hours a week of sheer boredom and a half hour of oh shit. And this definitely felt like an oh shit moment to him. Wayavana crouched down, and when he looked into the bushes, he hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the sun was still bright enough for him to see clearly, and he knew he was staring at the body of Sonya Ivanov. Wayavana stood up, but then he quickly bent over again and put his hands on his knees and breathed in several times through his nose. Wayavana knew Sonya's sister and brother-in-law quite well, and he couldn't imagine having to tell them what he had just discovered. But before Wayavana could worry about that, he had to act fast. He knew that the small Nome Police Department was not equipped to handle the forensics investigation required in a case like this. They would need help from the crime lab and the Alaska State Troopers. But both of those groups worked out of Anchorage, which was over 500 miles away, and there was no road that directly connected Anchorage to Nome, so it could take them a while to get there. Wayavana went back to his SUV, he opened the door and grabbed the radio. He called in to the officers on duty and told them he needed everyone to help him come lock down a crime scene and to make sure that nothing happened to it until help from Anchorage arrived. On August 14th, so a day after Sonya's body had been discovered, criminalist Carrie Cathcart from the Alaska State Crime Lab in Anchorage sat in the passenger seat of Officer Wayavana's SUV as they wound their way down the dirt mining road just outside of Nome. When Nome police had called the crime lab, the case was handed over to Cathcart. She booked a flight and had arrived in Nome earlier that morning. And while Nome police had waited for Cathcart to get there, they covered Sonya's body and most of the surrounding area with tarps to keep the crime scene as untouched as they possibly could. And Nome police officers had taken shifts guarding the crime scene to make sure nobody came near it. Wayavana eased off the gas and stopped the car several yards away from the crime scene. Cathcart looked out and she saw the tarps covering the area. She was used to visiting scenes days after a crime had taken place because traveling in Alaska often just took a lot longer than it would in other parts of the United States. Cathcart got out of the SUV, slipped on a pair of gloves, and followed Wayavana to the bushes on the side of the road. Cathcart wore hiking boots, a windbreaker over a dark shirt, and she had long blonde hair. Wayavana called another officer over, and together they removed a tarp from the bushes. Then they walked away from Cathcart and removed the remaining tarps that covered other parts of the crime scene. Cathcart stared down at Sonya's lifeless body inside of the bushes. Cathcart had worked homicide cases and other violent crimes for a few years, but it still hit her very hard when she saw victims as young as Sonya. As Cathcart approached the body, the most obvious thing that stood out about Sonya's body was that she was naked, except for a sock on one of her feet. But there were no clothes or scraps of torn fabric anywhere in the area. Then Cathcart moved in closer to get a better look. They would have to do a full autopsy and examination, but it was pretty clear to her right away that Sonya had died from a gunshot at close range. Cathcart asked an officer if Nome police had found bullet casings in the area, but the officer said they hadn't really found anything before they locked the site down and contacted Anchorage for help. Cathcart made her way back to the road and started scanning the dirt. She saw sets of tire tracks that looked like they matched a police SUV, like the one Wayavana was driving, but then she stopped cold and shouted for Wayavana to come look at something. Wayavana walked over to Cathcart on the road, and she pointed to a set of tire tracks in the dirt. He didn't really know why she was showing them to him, but then she motioned for him to come look closer, and she said the tracks were most likely from a truck, but importantly, it looked like the track had mismatched tires. This, of course, would make it much easier for the police to find this truck, especially because they were already starting with a small number of people who lived in Nome to begin with. So Weyavana made a note about the mismatched tires in his notebook. Then Cathcart followed those tire tracks back down the road towards the spot where Sonia's body was. Weyavana walked right behind her. Cathcart stepped over to the bushes right on the side of the road. She squinted her eyes and looked as closely as she could at every branch, and a slight smile began to come across her face. She turned to Weyavana and motioned for him to look at what she had just seen. And on one of the branches, she pointed to a streak of blue paint that she was almost certain had come from an automobile. So now Weyavana believed if he could just track down a blue truck with mismatched tires, he would have a good chance of finding Sonia's killer. In the days following Carrie Cathcart's examination of the crime scene, Nome police fanned out across the city. They spoke to Sonia's friends, her sister and brother-in-law, and anybody willing to come forward to say they had seen Sonia around the time she had disappeared. Officer Weyavana had met with Timmery the night Sonia's body had been discovered, but now he wanted to meet with her again to see if she might have any information that could lead him to the owner of a blue truck with these mismatched tires. So, on a warm August morning, Weyavana knocked on the door of Timmery and Sonia's house. Timmery opened the door, and Weyavana could see that her face was puffy and her eyes were bloodshot. It was clear she had been crying. Timmery led Weyavana into the small front room of the house. The place was messy, like a teenager's bedroom might be. There were clothes hanging on chairs and empty soda cans all over the coffee table. Timmery sat down on the couch, and Weyavana cleared off a chair and sat down across from her. Timmery was glad that it was Weyavana who had come to the house to talk to her. Timmery knew that Weyavana knew Sonia's sister, so Timmery believed Weyavana would do everything he could to find out who had killed Sonia. Weyavana started by just asking Timmery if she was okay, but she just shook her head and tried to fight off tears. Then he asked her if Sonia had any enemies or somebody who might have been angry with her. But Timmery said Sonia was one of the happiest, easygoing people she'd ever known, and everybody who had met her liked her right away. But then Timmery trailed off in the middle of a sentence, and she looked surprised, like she'd just thought of something that she believed she should have thought of a lot earlier. Weyavana asked her what was going on, and Timmery leaned forward on the couch, and she said there was a guy who Sonia had kind of hung out with a couple of times, and she knew they had kissed a couple of times, but it really wasn't anything serious. But Timmery said the guy was really into Sonia, but Sonia was not really into him. So Weyavana asked who this guy was, and Timmery would say it was a friend of theirs named Kunuk Angsuk. Then Timmery said that Kunuk was usually the nicest guy in the world, like a big teddy bear, but he did have a temper, and he could fly off the handle when he got mad. Officer Weyavana thanked her for the information. Then he asked Timmery if she happened to know what kind of car Kunuk drove, and she said he drove a blue truck. Weyavana's eyes lit up. He couldn't believe he'd possibly found the person he was looking for so quickly. He thanked Timmery again, and then he headed out of her house, got into his SUV, and drove down the street to the police station. And when he filled in the chief of police about what he had just learned, the chief set things in motion for them to impound and search Kunuk's blue truck. It took a few days to get everything in order, but then Weyavana, Officer Matt Owens, other members of the Nome police, and the criminalist Carrie Cathcart searched the truck, and they were stunned by what they found. Kunuk's truck was indeed blue, and it had mismatched tires that fit with the tracks that Cathcart had found on the mining road near Sonia's body. But that wasn't all. One of the truck's tires had blood spatter on it, and inside the truck, they found multiple rifles and a tarp that was covered in blood. And so after this discovery, police felt like they had found their killer. In late August, so a couple of weeks after Sonia had been found, Nome police had more than enough evidence to make Sonia's friend, Kunuk, their prime suspect. So Weyavana and another officer drove out to Kunuk's house. When police had taken his truck, Kunuk knew they would be back soon to talk to him. So he did his best to stay calm as he let the investigators back into his house. Kunuk had short brown hair, and he wore jeans and a yellow t-shirt, and he had a silver earring in his left ear. Kunuk sat down in a chair in the front room of his house, and the officers stayed standing. Weyavana didn't waste any time. He asked Kunuk when was the last time he'd seen Sonia. And Kunuk thought about it for a second, and then said the last time he saw her was maybe 2 weeks before she died. And Kunuk would say that he and Sonia didn't really even talk when he last saw her, that really they had just kind of crossed paths in town. After this answer, the other officer who was there with Weyavana asked why Kunuk had a bloody tarp in his truck and why was there blood spatter on one of his tires. Kunuk started tapping his foot on the floor, and he looked away from the cops, and without making eye contact, he told them that he'd been out hunting 70 miles away at the time of Sonya's death, and that's why the rifles and the bloody tarp were in his truck, and the blood on the tarp was just animal blood. But the officer pressed Kunuk again about the blood spatter on his tire. And this time, Kunuk did look back at the officer, and he would say that he'd run over a rabbit or some other kind of small animal when he was driving out to go hunting, and so the blood on the tire must have just been from that. The officers were totally skeptical of this answer, but they stayed neutral and continued to question Kunuk a bit longer, and then when they were finally done, the officers were convinced that this was their guy. The evidence against Kunuk was solid, and the running over the rabbit story just seemed like a convenient excuse he'd made up on the spot. So Weyavana asked Kunuk to submit to a DNA test, and he told Kunuk if he was innocent like he said he was, a DNA test was the best way to prove that. Kunuk continued to tap his foot on the floor, but then he looked at Weyavana and he nodded and said he would submit samples for the test. Weyavana knew he would have to wait for the results from this DNA test and for the results from the test that the crime lab was going to run on the blood found on Kunuk's truck and on the tarp. But Weyavana hoped that soon he would be able to tell Sonya's sister and the rest of Sonya's family and her friends that they had found Sonya's killer. In late August, so almost 3 weeks after Sonya's murder, her body was returned to the small village where she had grown up. And her family and friends there had a funeral service and an outdoor vigil to celebrate Sonya's life and to mourn the life she never got to live. At the vigil, people who knew and loved her most talked about how happy and kind Sonya had been and how much her community and her culture had meant to her. And they said they wanted police to bring this case to a close quickly and to make sure the person who had killed Sonya was brought to justice. But they knew that even if that happened, the village would never fully heal from what had been done to Sonya. At around 2 a.m. on a day in early September, about a week after the vigil, Officer Weyavana sat in his SUV in a parking lot off the main street in Nome. He cracked his window, took a long drag off a cigarette, and exhaled the smoke out into the early morning air. Just like Sonya's friends and family, Weyavana hoped the case would be solved soon, and he had really believed that Sonya's friend Kunuk was the killer. But in the weeks following Kunuk's interview, parts of the investigation had kind of come to a halt. Test results from the tarp found in Kunuk's truck revealed that the blood on the tarp was animal blood, just like Kunuk had said, and several of Kunuk's friends said they had been with him when he was hunting on the day of Sonya's murder. Weyavana still was not ready to move on from Kunuk as a suspect. But while he waited for results from Kunuk's DNA test to come back, the case suddenly didn't seem as open and shut as it had just a couple of weeks earlier. And now, the investigation team on this case had been reduced to just Weyavana and one other Nome officer. And Weyavana was stuck working nights while the other investigator worked days. So Weyavana sat in an empty parking lot near an empty street in the dead quiet of the morning, and he felt like he wasn't doing anything to help. Then he leaned over and grabbed a file folder from the passenger seat. Inside the folder were all of the notes that he and other officers had compiled during interviews they'd conducted following Sonya's murder. He flipped through the notes and tried to look at everything with fresh eyes, just in case he'd missed something. And as he read over a page right in the middle of the files, he almost gasped out loud. Weyavana was reading comments made by a woman who claimed she had seen Sonya get into a vehicle near a gas station at the same time that Sonya was believed to have disappeared. But for some reason, this woman's statement had never been followed up on. And so later that day, Weyavana, who was bleary-eyed and fighting off sleep, headed to that woman's house to talk to her. The woman said early on the morning of the murder, she had been smoking on her porch when Sonya had walked by and she had called out to her. The two of them had talked a bit, and then she watched as Sonya walked further down the street, got into a vehicle, and drove off. Then the woman gave a detailed description of the vehicle Sonya had climbed into, and it was not a blue truck. Weyavana thanked the woman and then rushed back to the police station where he told the chief of police all this new information he'd discovered. And the chief immediately put more officers back on the case, and they all went on a search to find this new vehicle that this woman had described. Just before 3 a.m. on September 23rd, so a few weeks after Weyavana had spoken to that woman, Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native, stood near a gravel pit down the road from where Sonya had been found. And in this gravel pit, Officer Owens saw a vehicle that matched the description of the one that woman had seen Sonia get into. Owens quickly called into the station and let them know what he'd found, and immediately other officers rushed out to the scene. But just minutes later, Officer Owens was on his cell phone to the police station again, but this time he was out of breath and he was running for his life. He kept shouting that gunshots had rung out right after he'd approached this vehicle in the gravel pit, and so now he was taking cover, but he needed backup fast. Not long after that, Ivana and other members of the force arrived at the gravel pit, and they saw that Owens was crouched down behind some bushes nearby. They leapt out of their cars and they fanned out all across the area looking for whoever had been shooting at Officer Owens, but they never found anyone. And so after the police had secured the area and made sure it was safe, they all reconvened with Officer Owens over at the gravel pit, and sure enough, inside of it was this car that Owens had found and called in. And they noticed the driver's side window was completely shattered, very likely from one of the rounds that had just been fired at Officer Owens. That day, the police would conduct a full search of this vehicle, and that search would lead them right to Sonia's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence discovered from the vehicle that Officer Owens found in the gravel pit, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of August 12, 2003, the day Sonia Ivanov was murdered. Just after 1 a.m., the killer drove slowly down the street in the center of Nome. Light rain fell on the windshield, and the mist gave the whole town kind of an eerie glow. The killer heard music coming from the bar, and they watched as a few drunk people stumbled outside. The killer laughed and just kept cruising down the street. And in the bright lights from the gas station up ahead, the killer saw Sonia walking on the side of the road. It was hard to miss the very beautiful 5-foot 11-inch tall teenager. The killer grinned, and they felt their hearts start to race a bit. Then they drove right past Sonia and hit the brakes. Then the killer rolled down the passenger window just as Sonia walked by, and they called out to her. Sonia stopped, walked over, and leaned in through the open window. The killer smiled and asked if Sonia wanted a ride home. Sonia liked walking in the rain, but there was a chance the storm could pick up quickly and get a lot worse, and it was getting late, so she said sure, she'd love a ride. The killer told her to hop inside, and so she did. She opened the door, got into the passenger seat, and then once Sonia was inside, the killer rolled up her window, they locked the doors, and drove down the road. But when they got to the point in the road where the killer should have turned to go to Sonia's house, they just kept on driving. Sonia said, "Hey, you missed the turn," but the killer just looked at her and smiled and then hit the gas. Sonia started to get scared and she asked the killer what they were doing, but the killer just told her to be quiet. When they reached the outskirts of town, the killer turned off the main road onto an old dirt road. Sonia desperately wanted to get out, but they were going so fast and she was just too scared to do anything. Finally, the killer slowed down and pulled into some bushes on the side of the dirt road and parked. Then the killer got out. Sonia tried to open her door, but she couldn't unlock it, and then she looked up out her window and she saw the killer standing there in the moonlight. Sonia screamed, and at the same time, the killer opened the door, they dragged her outside, and then wrapped their arms around her from behind. Sonia was tall and strong and fast, and so right away she began using all her strength to try to get out from the killer's grasp, and at some point she began leaning forward and bucking her legs out behind her, and she was able to get out of the killer's grip. But before Sonia could actually run away to freedom, the killer drew a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband and fired. And that bullet struck Sonia square in the back of the head. She fell to the ground, dead. Without wasting any time, the killer ran over and stripped off all of Sonia's clothes, except for one sock that they just overlooked. Then the killer dragged Sonia's body into a nearby bush. The killer went back to the road, grabbed Sonia's clothes, and tossed them into the trunk. Then the killer closed the trunk, took a deep breath, calmed themselves down, and got back into the driver's seat. Then they drove away from the murder scene inside of their Nome Police Department SUV. Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police Department killed Sonia. It turned out that woman who was smoking on her porch and then called out to Sonia on the night she disappeared, well, she saw Sonia get into a vehicle, and that vehicle was a police SUV. but the woman said she had not seen which one of the officers was driving the SUV at the time. The mismatched tire tracks that had been found at the murder scene turned out to be from a truck that a young man and woman had been driving, and the couple had just gone out to Lover's Lane on this mining road around the same time that Sonia was murdered. They had nothing to do with her murder. But the blue paint that criminalist Carrie Cathcart had found on the bushes ended up matching blue paint from the Nome Police Department insignia that was on all of their squad vehicles. And when Officer Owens had heard about this paint being found and about the woman who said she saw Sonia drive off with a cop, he went out and drove the police SUV that he'd been driving the night he killed Sonia out to the gravel pit and dumped it there. Then later, he went back and reported finding the dumped SUV in hopes that this would eliminate any suspicion towards him. And Officer Owens would say that he thought someone from town must have stolen the police SUV and then driven it out to the mining road where they killed Sonia. And Owens was the one who shattered the SUV's window and then called the station to say he was being shot at, to make it seem like whoever had really killed Sonia was now monitoring this vehicle and gonna kill anybody who went near it. But other Nome police officers and the Alaska State Troopers saw right through Owens' lies. After finding him at the gravel pit, crouched down behind some bushes as if he was being shot at, the general consensus was, this looks staged. And so when they got out and they talked to Owens and he described who was shooting at him and from where, it just didn't really add up. And they searched the area and of course didn't find any shooter. And also just generally, the other officers just didn't buy the idea that someone from town would have the audacity to steal a police SUV and then go commit a murder with the SUV in tow. It just didn't make sense. Also, criminalist Carrie Cathcart very early on had said that she believed whoever had killed Sonia had a deep understanding of how to sanitize a crime scene because there was no evidence left behind and her clothes had been removed. And so Cathcart actually said, the killer could be a cop. And so ultimately, Officer Owens was arrested for Sonia's murder. It would turn out that in the years Owens had lived in Nome, 6 local women had claimed he sexually assaulted them. And 2 of those women said they had filed formal reports with the Nome police, but nothing had ever been done about it. In Sonia's case, there was no evidence of assault or rape, but some officers believed Owens intended to sexually assault Sonia when he picked her up, but when she fought back, he killed her. Officer Matt Owens was convicted of murder and evidence tampering and sentenced to 101 years in prison with a chance for parole after 34 years. Sonia's murder shed further light on what many Alaska Native communities believed was a history of police neglect, harassment, and violence towards Alaska's indigenous population. And so, in 2007, the Sonia Ivanoff Act was signed into law in Alaska. That law states that any peace officer, firefighter, or correctional employee convicted of first-degree murder will receive a mandatory sentence of 99 years in prison. In the very early hours of May 26, 2013, 3 tugboats were towing this massive Chevron oil tanker in the Gulf of Guinea. They were about 32 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria. 2 of the tugboats were pressed up against the sides of this huge tanker to provide stability as it gets towed. The 3rd tugboat, which was called the Jascone 4, sat way out in front and had the main tow line strapped to the front of the tanker and was doing all of the actual towing. On board that lead tugboat, the Jascone 4, were 12 crew members who had all been hired by a company called West African Ventures. It was a Nigerian-based company. They owned the ship, and they had contracted them to come out and be a part of this towing operation. One of the crew members was a man named Harrison O'Keene. He was from Nigeria, and he was the ship's cook. At around 4:45 that morning, Harrison was in his quarters. He had been sleeping, but he had woken up because the ship was swaying pretty dramatically. It was very rough seas, but he, like the rest of the crew, were accustomed to rough, choppy water. So he gets up, he unlocks his bedroom door, and he goes out into the hall. When he looks down the hall, he sees that all of the other doors are shut and locked. The crew of the Jascone 4 had a policy that whenever they slept or were in their rooms, they would shut and lock the doors because piracy is a really big threat. After Harrison looked down the hall at all of these locked doors, He started making his way down the hall in the other direction towards the bathroom. He kind of stumbled down the hall as the ship rocked from the very rough seas. He gets to the bathroom and shuts the door at 4:50 in the morning. We know this because at 4:50 in the morning, a rogue wave hit the side of Jaskin 4 and almost completely flipped it upside down. Snapped the tow line, the ship is completely on its side and it's sinking very fast. He tried to push open the metal bathroom door, but already a surge of water is coming down the hall and pressing him into the bathroom. Pushes against that surge of water and gets the door open, and now he's standing on the ceiling of the hallway that he was just in a moment ago because the boat is now completely inverted. And he's looking down the hall. 3 of the crew members have managed to come out of their locked rooms and in a panic are trying to make their way up to the exit. He sees them as another surge of water blasts in through one of the windows and literally sweeps them away. And he knows they're dead. The power cuts out right as another surge of water is coming down the hall to him. He turns his body and this rush of seawater, this freezing seawater, comes pouring down the hall, and it takes Harrison and throws him down this little hallway and slams him into yet another bathroom. It was actually an officer's bathroom. It was connected to an officer's room. And so now he's inside of this other bathroom, and he's kind of like clamoring naturally, instinctively to go up to try to get to air, because that's what anyone would do if you're underwater in a panic. And as he's swimming up, he couldn't believe it when he gets to air. His head clears the surface in the bathroom, and he's in an air pocket, but it's pitch black. All the power is out. The ship is rapidly sinking. The water is freezing. Harrison has only got his boxer shorts on. He doesn't have a light source, he doesn't have food, he doesn't have water, and he has this couple cubic feet of air that any moment he's waiting for it to collapse. He knows these are his final moments, and he remembers a prayer that his wife had texted him before he started this particular job, and he started reciting the prayer in his head as he waited to die. The ship slams into the ocean floor, but the air pocket doesn't collapse. So Harrison is in this tiny little air pocket 30 meters below the ocean's surface. At this point, even though Harrison has no idea how he just survived the shipwreck, he now has to deal with the fact that he's eventually going to run out of air. He'll die of dehydration. He'll die of exposure. He's in freezing water up to his neck. And most terrifyingly, sharks and other animals are going to start converging on the ship to look for food. And he is in a bathroom that, although there's the air pocket, the door is open into the main hall, and his entire body is inside of this bathroom, meaning if a shark were in the hallway, swimming down the inside of this hall and it made it to the bathroom, he's completely exposed with no way to shut the door. It was wedged open. So his lower half is completely exposed to whatever wildlife is inside of this ship. So he literally is just waiting to die. He just doesn't know how he's going to die. After sitting there for quite a while, he started to feel very cold, and he knew that if he didn't find a way to get his body a little bit higher into the air pocket, basically get his upper body out of the water, that he was certainly going to die soon, just from hypothermia. Even though he knew he was doomed, his will to live it was bubbling through. He did not want to die yet. And as he's sitting there thinking, how is he going to get himself up into this air pocket? Because he had nothing he could step on or kind of stand on, he realized that right next to him there was the officer's room. This was the officer's bathroom, and the door was open. If he wanted to, he could dive down and swim through the door and go into the officer's bedroom and look for supplies. And in his mind, he thought he could probably pull off some of the paneling, because it's going to be pitch black in there. If he just swam straight to the far side of the room, he could get to some of the fake wood paneling or whatever it was, and he could yank it down. And as he's building up his courage to dive into pitch black water, he starts hearing this horrible sound of large sea creatures smashing into the boat. They were basically looking for entrance points into the boat. And then they would come into the boat, sharks, and he could hear them bumping up against the insides of the ship. And all he's thinking is, I'm completely exposed. I'm doomed. I gotta go. I gotta go in there. I gotta at least make an attempt to save myself. And so listening to sharks and other animals searching for things to eat, he takes a deep breath and in total darkness, he dives down and swims into the officer's bedroom. And as he's swimming, because he's just going straight across to the far wall to start yanking out that paneling, he's bumping into things that he believes are bodies. He doesn't know, but he thinks they are. He gets to the far wall and he yanks off a piece of paneling. He swims back. One successful trip. He goes back down and he makes a number of trips until he's able to fashion that little raft he had in mind, like a little step stool that pushed him up into the air pocket to where half of his upper body was now out of the freezing water. Also, while he was in the officer's room, even though it was pitch black, he was kind of like feeling around for things, and he wound up finding a bottle of soda and a flashlight. So he turns on his flashlight and he drinks his soda and he just takes a breath. Even though he's still in the same terrible situation, he's thankful for that little victory. About 24 hours would go by where he has this light on and he's nursing the soda. He knows he's either going to die from sharks, hypothermia, dehydration, something's going to kill him. But part of him is thinking, maybe if a dive team is able to locate the ship, they're going to come down to retrieve bodies. And maybe they'll find me. Maybe I can hold out that long. And so as he's thinking about this, he's getting a little flicker of hope. Two horrible things happen. His light goes out, flashlight doesn't work, at the same time that he describes hearing the large sea creatures make their way into the officer's room right next to him. So I want you to think about this. You're at the bottom of the ocean. You're in a ship that has sunk. You're in a little air pocket. You really don't have any supplies to last longer than a few days. It's total darkness. You had your flashlight, it's gone out. It's totally dark. A shark that has been eating your friends, or more than one shark, is now literally feet away from you, and you can hear it eating the bodies that apparently are in there. You are exposed to them because there's an entrance to that room and there's an entrance to the hall. The fear must have been indescribable. For the next 36 hours, Harrison sat there listening to a shark slam into the wall but never attack him. He heard sharks in the main section of the ship bumping around, waiting at any moment that if the ship were to just tilt a little bit, his air pocket's going to collapse. It's unfathomable how terrible those 36 hours must have been. At the 60-hour mark, he hears what sounds like something metal banging on the outside of the ship. He notices through the hallway, because he has a bit of a vantage point through the water down the hall in front of him, he sees a flicker of light. And there's no light down here, so it really stood out. Without even thinking about it, he takes a deep breath and swims right into the hallway, the one place he had not been since he had gone into the bathroom, because there are sharks. And he starts swimming farther and farther and farther away from his air pocket, and he's running out of air. He can't find the light. He doesn't even know if he saw a light. He thinks he might be hallucinating, and he's realizing, I'm almost out of air. He's looking around, and he decides, I gotta go back to my air pocket. And he turns around, and he's trying to swim back. He's looking for his bathroom. He's swimming as fast as he can. He's about to run out of air, and he makes it to his air pocket, and his head goes up, and he takes a big breath. And he's not sure if he really actually saw the light or not. And he's thinking, that was it. I thought I was going to be rescued, but I was just imagining it. And then a miracle. It was a diver, and the diver had come back. The diver was part of a crew that had been sent down to recover bodies. No one lives for 3 days underwater. So the diver comes down his way, and Harrison knew that he was going to scare the daylights out of this diver. And so he gently touched him on the back. And the diver reacts really violently because he's expecting it to be an animal of some kind. And Harrison reaches out and just grabs the diver's hand and squeezes it gently and shows him his hand. And the diver's got a big light on his head, pokes his head up into this air pocket. You see this man that for the past 36 hours has been in total darkness with absolutely no way out. He was done for. And the look on Harrison's face is just, it's priceless. They fitted Harrison with a dive mask and they brought him up. He did not immediately go to the surface because he had been at depth for so long. He had to go through something called decompression. If he had just breathed air at normal pressure, he would have died. So they put him in a decompression chamber for 60 hours before actually bringing him to the surface. And so ultimately Harrison was okay, but the trauma of this experience was so extreme that to this day, Harrison's wife says that basically every night he wakes up thinking he's on a sinking ship. Our next story is called I Got This. In 1983, 23-year-old Tammy Ashcroft was engaged to 34-year-old Richard Sharp. The couple had bonded over their shared love of sailing, and generally they spent more time on the water than on land. In October of that year, a friend approached the couple and asked if they'd be willing to take their 44-foot yacht from Tahiti to San Diego. Though the trip would be over 4,000 miles long, significantly longer than any one trip either of them had ever taken on the open water, they both felt very confident in their seafaring abilities, and so they agreed to do it. The journey started out fine, but at the 2-week mark, when they were just north of the equator, they heard about a hurricane that could be making its way up to where they were going. And so even though they anticipated it would kind of peter out and actually not even hit them, they decided it was still in their best interest to try to sail completely away from the path of the storm to safer waters. But over the next couple of days, the storm only intensified and continued to change directions, making it really hard to predict where safer waters was going to be. And so Tammy and Richard kept desperately trying to get farther and farther away from the storm, but it was like every time they would change course and get farther away, the storm would speed up and change directions and still be coming straight for them. And so finally it got to the point where Tammy and Richard realized they could not actually outpace the storm, that they would have to weather it. And so on the day it was going to hit them, they donned their rain gear and they boarded up the windows, and then they stood on the deck of their yacht looking out at the horizon as this Category 4 hurricane is just barreling straight towards them. Tammy would go on to say that she never fully appreciated just how terrifying being in a hurricane is out at sea until she was in one. She said it was a constant barrage of 50-foot waves that would literally launch the yacht. It would become airborne, and then it would come crashing down, and each time it landed, she felt like the boat was going to break in two, and then as soon as it did slam down, another wave would land on top of them. And so it just felt like at any moment the ship was just going to be consumed by the ocean. But Tammy and Richard were excellent sailors, and Richard was up in the cockpit, and he was doing everything he could to keep the boat from not flipping over, and after a little while, he had figured out a way to kind of ride the waves in such a way that they would not get totally tossed each time. And after a couple hours of just absolute chaos, it started to seem like they had made it through the worst of the storm, and that more than likely they were going to make it out of this thing relatively unharmed. And so around this time, as the storm was beginning to calm down, Richard is anchored in place in the cockpit. He's a safety line attached to him to the ground, so he's not going anywhere. And Tammy is just exhausted. It was just so stressful being through the storm. And Richard noticed, and he says, "Tammy, I got this up here. Go down into the cabin and just try to get some rest." And Tammy was very grateful, and she agreed. She opened the doors to the cabin, and she had made it all the way downstairs when she hears Richard yell out from up in the cockpit, "Oh my God!" before a rogue wave comes crashing into their boat head on, flipping the boat backwards like a backflip onto the top, so it's upside down in the water. And Tammy would say it felt like someone ripped the boat out from under her feet, and then she came crashing down and smashed her head and was knocked unconscious. When Tammy woke up 27 hours later, she was laying in the cabin against a chair and half on the ground, and she opens her eyes, and the cabin she's in is half submerged, and everything inside of it has either been thrown on the ground or it's been broken. There's papers, there's tools. I mean, the place is just a disaster down there. And she can tell the cabin is also slowly filling with water. After the boat had backflipped and Tammy had been knocked unconscious, it continued to get thrown around by waves before miraculously landing upright. Tammy could barely remember what happened, and she's totally overwhelmed by what she's seeing. She's in shock, and all she knows is she has to go up on deck to find Richard. And so she gets up and wades through the water. She gets to the stairs. She's yelling for Richard. She goes up on deck and she looked around and the boat was just ruined. And she's yelling for Richard. She's looking around. He's nowhere to be found. And then she looks up at the cockpit where she last saw him and she can see his safety line that was attached to him, keeping him anchored to the boat, was now dangling off the back of the boat. She ran to the back. She looked, and the safety harness had actually come undone. It had been broken in the storm, and Richard was gone. He had been swept into the ocean, and he was not wearing a life jacket. And Tammy would say he had actually taken it off earlier in the storm and left it down in the cabin. And then when the storm was raging again, he was back up top, anchored in place, and just didn't think to go down and get it. And they both were just not thinking about it. It was just one of those things in a really chaotic situation that got overlooked. And while Tammy wanted to grieve the loss of her fiance, it was like she couldn't. Her survival instincts were kicking in, and she knew if she didn't act quickly to fix this situation, she too would die. And so she began robotically taking stock of the boat's condition, and she saw the masts had broken clean off, the sails were now dragging in the water, the engine, the radio, the electronic navigation system, the emergency position indicator device, all of it was ruined. And so all alone in the middle of the ocean with nothing in sight, no ships, no land, no anything, on a ruined ship that is gradually sinking, after finding out your fiance has been swept out to his death in the middle of a storm, Tammy managed to stay composed and she built a makeshift sail and began sailing the ship, and she also began slowly pumping the water out of the cabin. She went back into the cabin and she discovered some of the almanacs were still in there, and she discovered there was a current that she thought she could get to, and so using just a sextant and a watch, she manually navigated this broken down ship using this makeshift sail into this current, and then for 41 days she survived on canned food and peanut butter, and she sailed 1,500 miles to Hawaii. And the whole time she's thinking to herself, if my calculations are off, that this is not the current I'm supposed to be in, I will sail past Hawaii out into the open water and I will run out of food and water and I will die. But she didn't die because her calculations were spot on. When Tammy finally stepped foot on land in Hawaii, she was relieved that, she had made it and that she was going to live. But at the same time, she had this flood of emotions where she was suddenly so sad about the loss of Richard. It was like she really hadn't had a chance to grieve his loss because that whole time after the accident, she was focused on survival. And although Tammy would make a full recovery, it would take her 6 years to learn how to read again because of the head injury she sustained when the boat capsized. But when she did regain that skill, she finally stopped and she wrote her and Richard's story in a book called Red Sky and Morning that became an international bestseller and was converted into a movie called Adrift.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Candy.
In 1971, Julianne Kepka was a bright-eyed German teenager who had just graduated high school. On Christmas Eve of 1971, she and her mother were at the airport in Lima, Peru, waiting for a flight to Pucallpa to visit her father, who was a zoologist working in the Amazon. She and her mother and everybody else waiting for this flight were really annoyed because the flight was 7 hours late due to bad weather. Finally, it arrived, and Julianne, her mother, and everybody else who had been waiting boarded Lanza Flight 508. And immediately after takeoff, they started hitting some pretty bad turbulence because of the bad weather. But Julianne really liked flying, so she didn't mind. Her mother, on the other hand, was white-knuckling the armrests. But after 10 minutes or so, as they were getting nearer to cruising altitude, the turbulence was not getting any better. In fact, it was getting much worse, and Julianne was starting to get worried herself. And then when the plane started shaking so violently that all of the overhead bins opened up, and luggage and wrapped presents and Christmas cakes started pouring out, Julianne now began white-knuckling the armrest. As she's sitting there, she looks out the window and she sees all this lightning right outside their window, and it was clear they were literally flying through a lightning storm. And so Julianne and her mother are just looking at each other, unable to speak because they're so scared, and they're listening to the other passengers screaming and yelling, and everyone's starting to panic. And then the plane starts really shaking up and down, like it's being lifted 50 feet and dropping 50 feet over and over. And then all of a sudden, there's this bright flash inside of the cabin, and then the lights go out. And then they look out the left side, and they see smoke and flames coming out of the engine that sits on the wing. And then the plane felt like it was just falling from the sky before it dipped into an aggressive nosedive and just started bombing straight down toward the ground. It turned out that big flash in the cabin was lightning striking the engine. Julianne would say, despite this unbelievable chaos, the worst moment imaginable, her mother grabbed her by the hand and said, "This is it. It's all over." And that was the last thing her mother ever said to her. After that, all Julianne can remember is the sound of other passengers screaming and crying and the awful grinding sounds that the engines were making. And as she's listening to these horrible sounds getting ready to die, all of a sudden the noise just stops and she's outside of the plane. She's still strapped into her seat, but now she's in free fall away from the plane. And she remembers thinking how unbelievably lonely she was. And then she looked down and she saw the canopy of the jungle fast approaching, and she knew she was about to die, and then she passed out. She remembers nothing of the actual impact, but she would later find out the plane broke up 2 miles up. So she was in free fall for 2 miles in that seat before hitting the ground. She woke up the next day looking upwards towards the jungle canopy, and the first thing she said out loud was, "I survived." And she's looking around and she yells for her mother, but there's no one around her, no one yells back. And that's when she realizes, I'm all alone, and probably everybody, including my mother, is dead. She had somehow managed to not only survive, but only have a broken collarbone and some deep cuts in her leg. She could hear planes overhead that were most likely looking for the crash site and potentially survivors, but she couldn't see them because the canopy was so thick, so they couldn't see her. She was wearing a very short sleeveless mini dress and flip-flops, but in fact she had lost one of her flip-flops, but elected to keep the other one on because she had lost her glasses in the crash and she was incredibly nearsighted, and so she would use this one flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her before committing with her bare foot. Before the crash, she had spent a year and a half at her parents' research station out in the Amazon, and in that time she'd picked up very valuable survival skills for being in the rainforest. So the first thing she did was stand up and go looking for a stream, because her father had told her, wherever there's a stream, that stream will oftentimes lead to civilization. And so she began walking, and sure enough, she found a stream. And instead of just walking next to the stream, she got in it and began walking directly in the middle of the stream, because her parents had told her that you're less likely to get attacked by a predator if you're standing in the water versus standing on land. She only walked a little ways before she came across the crash site. There was no bodies, it was just debris, and all she could find that was useful was a small bag of candy. So she took the bag of candy and continued walking down the stream. And for several days she trudged along, and she would say during the day it was incredibly hot and miserable, and at night it was very cold, and since she only had this small dress on, it was particularly miserable. But she said the scariest part of the whole ordeal was at night when you're trying to sleep, it's totally pitch black and you're in the middle of the Amazon and there's predators all around you. She said it was horrifying. On the fourth day of being in the jungle, as she walked down the stream, she heard the sound of a landing king vulture, a sound that she recognized from her time spent at her parents' Amazon reserve. And the sound of this vulture was just around the corner, so she couldn't see it, but she knew these huge vultures only showed up if there's a ton of dead meat. And so she knew as soon as she rounded that corner, she was going to come face to face with the bodies from the crash, potentially even her mother. But she kept moving forward, she turned the corner, and sure enough, there were bodies. The vulture took off, and what she was left looking at was a bench with 3 passengers on it still buckled in, and all 3 of their heads had been rammed underneath the earth. They had clearly landed head first. Immediately, she had an intense sense of panic because she had never seen a dead body before, and she thought one of them was her mother. But when she went over to examine this particular corpse, she saw her toenails were painted pink, and her mother never painted her toenails. And so she had this intense sense of relief that it wasn't her mother, but at the same time felt very ashamed of that thought. There was nothing on the three bodies or near them that could help her survive, and so she said her goodbyes and she continued walking down the stream. By the 10th day of this ordeal, she could barely stand straight because of a broken collarbone and the pain in her leg, and so she began drifting down the river in one of the deeper sections, and then she thought she was hallucinating when she saw this big boat docked up against the side of the river. But when she went up to it and touched it, it was real. She went up on shore, she looked inside, there was no one in the boat, but it looked like a boat that was used, and there was a path that led back into the jungle. And so she followed the path and it led to this hut, and no one was in there, but outside was a jug of gasoline. And she had this wound in her arm that was full of maggots. And she remembered her father using gasoline to get maggots out of a wound in their dog. And so she took the gasoline and dumped it in her arm, and she said it was excruciatingly painful, but she was able to pull out 30 maggots and felt very proud of that accomplishment. After that, she fell asleep inside of the hut and just hoped that whoever lived here eventually showed up. And sure enough, the next day she woke up and she heard two men talking outside that were walking towards her. And she said the sound of their voice was like the sound of an angel. And when the two men came up the path and saw her, they were obviously very shocked. And they initially thought she was like this water goddess from a local legend that involved a half mermaid, half woman that was light-skinned. And she would tell them in Spanish that she's not a water goddess, that in fact she's a girl, and she had just survived a plane crash and she really needed their help. It was getting late that day, so they couldn't bring her out of the jungle right away, so they helped treat her wounds, they gave her some food and water, and the next day they brought her back to civilization. The day after her rescue, she was reunited with her father, and apparently he was so overcome with emotion because he believed she was dead that for several hours he just couldn't speak. Julianne was the sole survivor of the 91 people who boarded Lanza Flight 508. Her mother actually survived the crash, but then died several days later because she couldn't move. This is something that haunts Julianne and her family because they think about how horrible those last few moments for her mother must have been. Julianne ultimately recovered from all of her physical injuries, but to this day deals with significant emotional trauma.
The MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate